I remember the exact sound the shower made the night I first knew everything had ended. It was a small domestic percussion, water on tile, a faint steady hiss. But of all the noises that had filled our apartment, that one cut through me like a blade. I had been 2 flights of stairs below, hands full of takeout and a phone buzzing with a message that was both ordinary and lethal. A photo of Liam's toothbrush resting in a cup that was not ours. "My name is Harper." I told myself then I would not cry. I would catalogue. Crying felt like conceding to the chaos, and I had never been chaos's friend. I put the food down on the tiny kitchen table, sat, and made a list in my head. Names, dates, small things that would later become the scaffolding for what I wanted. Liam. Nina. The apartment on Holden Street. The laugh he made when he thought I couldn't hear. The way he left the toothpaste half squeezed in the sink. For 2 years, Liam had been the center of my gravity. He was handsome in a soft, unthreatening way. Round cheekbones, a mop of hair he never quite tamed, a voice that could be gentle or patronizing with the same inflection. We had met in a bookstore over a dog-eared copy of Wolf, and somewhere between the first hesitant touches and the slow, steady fuse of living together, I had trusted him in the currency generous people trade with. My time, my routines, my private rooms. I had been careful in other ways. I'd learned to spot small lies at the edges. A name missing from a call log, a receipt that didn't match a description. I was not naive. I was cautious. The toothbrush photo, though, unspooled that caution into irony. He had been careless enough to leave a tangible trace. That night I did not go up. I sat in the light of my phone, scrolling through his messages, my hands steady despite the tremor in my chest. I expected to find a neat, explainable pattern. One long rehearsal of a lie that could be trimmed to fit back into the life I wanted. Instead I found a web. Nina wasn't a one-off. She was a presence. Late-night messages, planned lunches, a string of photos from rooftops with captions Liam had sent me as if they were small, private jokes. He had been telling her things he once told me. Anger arrived cold and precise. I did not imagine revenge as a pyrotechnic act. I imagined it as demolition, surgical, inevitable. I pictured Liam's life as a house built on sand. All I would do was remove the foundation supports, one by one, and watch the structure submit to the laws of gravity. I began with inventory. Names, locations, schedules. Nina's profile was public, a careful collage of travel photos and an accountant's neatness about career accomplishments. Liam's extraneous email was the key. It had been used to book an apartment for weekend work, and the credit card statements tied him to a small Airbnb on Holden Street, the same one where his toothbrush had been photographed. I should say here that I do not glamorize what came next. There are parts of what I did that sit in me like a stain. There are nights that I replay different choices and wish I had chosen them. But this is what I chose. I conscripted my mind as weapon. If he had treated feelings like disposable items, then my reply would not be melodramatic or impulsive. It would be adapted, patient, and precise. I started by getting closer to the life he was keeping secret. I introduced a casual detective into my social routine. Daniel, a co-worker who had a knack for befriending anyone and a hobbyist's interest in photography. He was useful because he loved being useful. He loved missions that had no consequences beyond the thrill. I asked him to see the city in ways I didn't have time to. The first time he called me from the Holden Street block, his voice was the same excited cadence he used when telling me about a new camera lens. "There's a woman there, Harper," he said. "Takes pictures on the balcony. She wears yellow in a way that hurts." From the balcony, the world of the unfaithful looked ordinary. Nina and Liam, in truth, were not cinematic. They drank coffee out of chipped mugs and argued about which of them had left the kettle on. There was no grand passion, only comfortable habits stitched into the small hours. That contrast steadied me. I realized the affair was not an epic that had been stolen from me. It was a set of soft compromises my man had chosen above me without a single articulate apology. My first move in the campaign was containment. I closed the gaps in my vulnerability. I changed passwords. I reorganized our apartment so that nothing of mine could be used against me. I kept receipts. If he wanted to pretend we were all still right, then he would be responding to a mirror polished by careful hands. Then I started to unwind his exterior scores, the ones that mattered in the world beyond our apartment. Liam worked freelance in design. His stability depended not only on charm but on reputation. I learned how to speak quietly to a reputation. I found threads, a minor unpaid invoice he'd let slide, a disgruntled client who whispered about late deliveries, a former colleague who remembered how eager Liam had been to cut corners. I planted those threads in the right ears. The aim was not to fabricate, but to rearrange the truth. People heard what they wanted when it confirmed something they already suspected. I believed in psychological warfare. So I moved my second piece onto the board. Doubt. I did not confront him with the toothbrush. I let him think I did not know. I greeted him with a softness that was unfamiliar to both of us. I asked about mundane things, about his plans, about meetings that did not exist. He relaxed. He showed me the open maps of his life as if I were a tourist admiring nothing more than architecture. That was the turning point. That was when his arrogance became a lever. I began to blur the edges of his memories. I took photos of our home as evidence of togetherness and carefully recaptioned them in places where they would be seen by the people who mattered. I sent drafts of invoices to clients with small errors that only a meticulous eye would notice. His signature, deliberately misspelled. I left notes, in my handwriting, about minor things he'd said. People he'd learn, were watching him with a new lens. There is a cruelty innate to strategic anger. The pleasure in watching someone who has betrayed you attempt to navigate an altered reality. It is not that I wanted him to suffer. I wanted him to understand the architecture of his own choices. The public response was better than I imagined. A late-night tweet about a creative burnout that made his collaborators question his reliability was retweeted. A small design blog that had once praised his work posted a piece about capacity and client trust, and used one of his projects as a case study without naming him. It gathered comments, fingers pointed, beyond the streetlight of anonymity. But reputation can be rebuilt. I knew that. So I aimed higher, not merely his professional standing, but the relationships he used as scaffolding. Liam's mother Ruth adored him. She had been the one to call after we had moved in together, bringing soup and a softness I thought would never be reserved for me. I made direct contact with Ruth. I sent her a letter that read more like a confession than an accusation, an elegant document that contained dates and small, verifiable details. I wrote it as if I were asking for counsel, for help in understanding. Mothers are vulnerable to that voice. Ruth called me. Her voice shook in a way that jarred something loose in Liam's life. She visited, saw the apartment, noticed small things that made her suspicious, and asked him questions that I had not dared voice. By then, Liam had started to sense a pattern of pressure. He blamed work stress, bad sleep, a misunderstanding. He tried to apologize. That apology was half-cooked and tasted of a man who had not eaten his own words. I took his apologies and turned them into leverage the way an alchemist turns base metals into gold. I forgive you, I said once, in a voice that was almost a lullaby, because I want you to see that forgiveness doesn't erase what you did. He flinched as if I had struck him. The affair continued in its small, stuttering way. They had not expected me to look so calmly. They were complacent. This complacency would be their downfall. My piece de resistance was not scandalous. It did not involve a grand public exposure with screaming tabloids, not because I lacked the capacity to engineer one but because that would have been theater rather than justice. What I wanted was control of the narrative and of his immediate world. I wanted him stripped of the comfortable certainty that someone else would always perform the role of keeper. So I built a smaller, more intimate trap. I made plans that required him to rely on people I had already primed. Clients who could be stubborn, friends who were easily persuaded, a landlord with a short fuse. I whispered just enough doubt into each contact that they would hesitate at the precise moment he needed them. A client cancelled a deadline extension he thought secure. A friend forgot to send him an important file. The landlord sent a terse message about a minor lease violation. None of these things individually were devastating, but together they formed a chorus of inconvenience that began to look intentional. Liam grew frantic in a particular, undignified way. Panic revealed character as neatly as any test. I listened when he spoke, when he chewed his fingernails until they cracked, when he tried to pass off his slip-ups as fatigue. I kept my face still. I let him collapse under his own making. There is a moment in every scheme when you must decide whether to finish or to stop. I knew, intellectually, the point at which continuing would make me into something like him, vindictive, unmoored, a petty monarch presiding over a ruined life. I also knew pragmatically that stopping now would return him to safety, his life repaired, his conscience lubricated into forgetfulness. I chose to finish. The final act was a conversation. If the rest of my campaign had been the careful arrangement of dominoes, This was the finger that would push. I invited him to dinner at the small restaurant where we had had our first real argument about marriage. Ironically, the moment I had learned how to get under his skin. He arrived late, apologetic, smelling faintly of the soap he used and something floral that remembered another woman. He sat down. I could see the resignation in the set of his jaw. "Tell me everything," I said. He laughed, a brittle sound. "Everything about what?" "Everything," I repeated. "About Nina. About the toothbrush. About the lies I could have forgiven if they were honest." For a moment he stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. My hair tied back, my eyes the color of someone who has made a decision to be dangerous. The waiter took our order and drifted away. Liam started to speak in fragments, excuses assembled like a flimsy fence. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally, exasperation raw. "Do you want me to tell the truth? Do you want me to confess?" I let the words sit between us like a loaded silence. "I want you to understand how small things accumulate," I said. "I want you to see that your choices had a gravity that pulled others with it." I told him, then, about the letter to his mother, about the invoice edits, about the clients I had approached. I watched as the color drained from his face. He tried to laugh it away. He accused me of being theatrical. I watched him search for allies in the restaurant, for anyone to bail him out with a joke. He had none. That absence felt like salvation and punishment at once. He stood up abruptly. He said I was cruel. He said I had no right. He left without paying for his coffee. People looked after him and then away. The world resumed its hum. After that night, things began to unravel in ways I had not orchestrated and could not predict. He lost a client to a rumor I had started. Ruth stopped visiting. She told me later that she needed space to think. Nina unfollowed him publicly, then privately texted him something I will never read, and then disappeared from his life. He started to drink at odd hours and posted vague, performative apologies online that read like a man trying to convince a stranger. His work stalled. He phoned me some nights, voice hoarse, asking for forgiveness in ways that felt like asking for asylum. I had wanted him to feel the collapse of what he had taken for granted. I wanted him to taste the instability he had created as if it were his own. Victory, if it can be called that, was not immediate. There were nights I lay awake and considered the unanticipated consequences. A neighbor's cat died of unknown causes, and for 2 days I imagined the worst. A client I had impugned called me, furious and threatening legal action. Ethics, it turned out, were not as amenable to my neat calculus as I had hoped. The crucial difference in the end was that Liam's story did not have the resilience mine did. I had rebuilt myself as I manufactured the fracture. I volunteered at a shelter I had never told him about. I went back to school in the mornings and took classes that taught me a language I barely knew. I learned to ride a bicycle properly. I wrote in a journal in a tight, disciplined hand, so that my thoughts would not scatter into indecipherable confessions. I found work that paid modestly but with a rhythm I had missed. While I dismantled his life, I constructed tiny, meaningful scaffolds for my own. Months later, he moved out. He took only what he could carry, which, for him, seemed to be less than one might expect given the years we had shared. He left the apartment with the steady gait of a man trying to seem unbroken. I watched him go from the doorway, the key still warm in my palm. I did not gloat. The scene lacked a soundtrack. It was, like most real endings, messy in small ways that no screenplay could fully capture. After he left, people asked me if I had felt triumphant. There was a short-lived public curiosity. A few friends who asked for the gossip with a softness that brushed my skin like rain. I told them what they'd already guessed. I described the moment he packed his bag and the way his hands trembled. They wanted the theatrical final line, the moment of catharsis when the protagonist stands watchful and whole. In truth, I felt a kind of exhausted clarity. A person who has survived something violent emerges with a porousness that is uncomfortable and useful. It makes you sensitive to small betrayals and small kindnesses alike. The aftermath settled into routines. I traced the things I missed and learned how to love them again. I baked bread that browned perfectly at the edges. I learned to read maps without always looking for an escape route. I said yes to things that made me nervous. Dances, a trip to an island that required an airplane. I met people whose lives were not my mirror. I allowed myself to be wrong about things again. Once, I bumped into Liam at a bus stop. He recognized me before I recognized him, which was testament to the stubborn familiarity we formed together. He looked thinner, or perhaps less comfortable in his skin. He said my name like an apology. I nodded. He asked if we might speak, if we might reconcile for the sake of shared history. There was a pleading undertone that made my heart recoil. I had done enough for both of us. I told him, kindly but irrevocably, that there was nothing to reconcile. Reconciliation would have required honesty. He had not practiced in the most important places. He left that afternoon like a fact closing, the way a book slaps shut on the closing line. I watched him go and felt no victory and no relief, only the soft, relentless sense that I had chosen a life with different currencies. Truth, routine, small joys that did not need to be bought with the currency of other people's sacrifices. If the story needs a moral, perhaps it is this. Revenge is not an act of retribution that restores what was stolen. It is a cold arithmetic that demands you become precise enough to destroy and constructive enough to rebuild. The person you become in the middle of it is not always the person you wish to be, but sometimes that person is the only one who will survive what has been done. Years from that kitchen table and that toothbrush photo, I understood something else. Liam's betrayal had been a tearing of a fabric. My revenge was the rearranging of the weave. I had not only taken from him what he had taken from me. I had remade my life so that lodging the same injury in me again would be impossible. That, ultimately, was what it means to win. Not to enact a spectacular downfall, but to reconfigure your world so your damage becomes your teacher rather than your identity. There were nights when I still dreamed of the smell of coffee in the Holden Street apartment and of Nina's yellow dress. Dreams have a way of stealing the solid edges from reality. I woke each time with the same knowledge. I had done what I had needed to do, and I had paid the price in small regrets and the moral detritus that sticks to any sharp undertaking. In the end, the victory that mattered was quiet. It was learning to sleep without checking my phone twice. It was the day I walked down to the harbor and laughed, not because something was funny, but because the sound felt like a new muscle working. It was meeting my reflection and feeling its warmth. Revenge had been an education. It taught me the measures of the world I wanted to inhabit and the limits of what justice could be for a private pain. I had wanted him to fall. He did. I had wanted to be seen. I was. But the real triumph was less theatrical and more durable. Reclaiming my sense of self away from the space he had once occupied. Harper had been betrayed and responded with a plan. Harper lost parts of herself along the way, yes, but she gained an architecture that would not let anyone else use her life as a staging ground. Sometimes I think of the toothbrush. It was small and ordinary, the kind of object that could have been left by 100 careless strangers. It became, for me, a symbol of what you leave behind when you choose someone other than the life you promised. I kept that photograph for a while, not as a trophy, but as a ledger. It reminded me of the day I decided to become dangerous in the only way that mattered. Precise, relentless, and eventually, merciful to myself. I didn't expect the quiet to feel suspicious. Silence after you've waged a precise war sounds like a room with the electricity cut. You keep waiting for the refrigerator to hum again, for the pipes to knock, for the air to admit it's moving. Weeks went by without Liam's calls, without any new ripples from the lives I deliberately nudged. I tried to accept the quiet as a neutral thing. But one evening, as I folded a clean shirt into thirds, I realized my body was braced as if for an impact that hadn't arrived. When the impact did arrive, it was small and unassuming, the way most real tremors are. An email landed in my inbox from a mediation firm I didn't recognize. The subject line, Voluntary Conference Invitation. Personal and Professional Reputation Matters. I almost deleted it. Then I read the body, which carried that bland tone bureaucrats use when they're about to ask you to set yourself on fire for alignment. It was from a mediator named Alana Reese. She said Liam had requested a conversation to resolve tensions affecting his work and personal ties. Voluntary, I said out loud to the empty room, and felt something in me tilt. He'd found a way to turn the thing into a process, to flatten the moral edge into paperwork. I wrote back. I'll attend. 1 hour. I won't discuss anything that requires me to lie. Alana replied within an hour. Neutral, polite. Wednesday, 10 a.m., a glass building with a kind of lobby designed to make you feel small and solvable. On Wednesday, I wore gray. Not black, too cinematic, and not blue, too conciliatory. Gray is a color that says I'll be here until you're finished pretending. The receptionist offered me water in a cup that pretended to be glass. I declined. Alana's office had the usual props, a plant trying to touch a window, framed degrees, a small bowl of mints that had become a collective noun. Liam was already seated. He stood when I entered. He looked older, not much, but enough that the life he'd been living had left a kind of dust on him. There was a neat folder on the table in front of him. People who are sure they're right love folders. Harper, he said. There was a practiced tremor in it. Liam, I said and sat. Alana began with a speech about ground rules. I watched Liam's hands. The skin around his knuckles was dry, chewed. He kept his fingers on the folder as if the papers could authorize him. I asked for this, he said when it was his turn. Because the last few months have been. I've had trouble getting work. Some of my clients have heard things. My mother thinks, he paused, recalibrating. There have been misunderstandings. Misunderstandings, I repeated, as if tasting a new spice. I'm taking responsibility, he said quickly, aware that not saying the phrase would cost him points on some imaginary scorecard. For what I did. For Nina. For lying. I've told you that. You told me when you needed something, I said. That's not the same as telling the truth. Alana made a small note. Let's keep our focus on what can change, she said. What outcome would be acceptable to you both? There it was, the move. He wanted an outcome, a measurable thing he could report back to anyone who asked. We're fine, we mediated, see the certificate. I felt a small flare of anger at the administrative arrogance of it. Liam opened his folder and slid a page toward me. A statement. Drafted. It said nothing and everything, that we had experienced challenges, that rumors had overstated his professional unreliability, that we were choosing to move forward privately. He had left blanks for our names and the date. I looked at Alana. Does this count as mediation, I asked, or is this notarized theater? She didn't smile. This is a draft, she said. You're under no obligation. I didn't touch the paper. No, I said. I won't sign a narrative that suggests my accuracy was hysteria. Liam's jaw twitched. I'm just trying to work, he said. You've made that hard. I rearranged the truth you manufactured, I said. If work relies on people never being allowed to connect dots, perhaps try dots that connect. He exhaled, a thin thread of air. Then he tried another angle. Harper, I'm sober now, he said, and I believed he had practiced that sentence in front of a mirror because it arrived with too much punctuation. I'm seeing someone twice a week. He glanced at Alana. A therapist. Good, I said. Do the work. I am, he said, and his eyes flashed with that indignation particular to people unfamiliar with sustained effort. But the sabotage. Consequences, I said. Has to stop, he finished, ignoring me. You proved whatever you wanted to prove. Alana cleared her throat. Harper, she said, is there anything reasonable that, if Liam did, would lead you to stop taking actions that affect his professional life? I let the question sit. It wasn't unfair. I had decided to finish. Perhaps this was the finishing I hadn't anticipated needing. I thought about Ruth, about the careful way she held a teacup with 2 fingers, about the letter I had written in a voice that wasn't quite mine. I thought about Nina's yellow dress and the balcony and the way the city had kept breathing through it all. Yes, I said finally. I want 3 things. None require me to lie. 1. A written apology that addresses me by name and says the word cheated without a euphemism. Not public. For me. 2. A confirmation email, to 3 clients whose trust you leveraged while you were lying, that says you missed deadlines because of your choices, not because of anyone else's allegations. 3. 0 contact with me or people who love me after this is done. No more narrative management. Liam stared at me as if I'd handed him a broom and pointed to a mess he'd refused to see. I can do the first 2, he said after a long minute. The third. I live here, Harper. Then live without me as your alibi, I said. He looked at Alana, as if for rescue. She was occupied with writing my list down. These seem concrete, she said. Doable. She turned to him. Do you agree? He swallowed. Yes, he said, the word landing like a coin on a counter. Fine. The meeting ended with the ritual of calendars and next steps. In the elevator down, I saw our reflections in the doors. 2 people who had once been young together, upgraded to strangers by the failure to tell the truth at the right time. He sent the apology that weekend. It was artless and therefore useful. He didn't try to make the wound pretty. He named it. He sent the client emails, copying me, brevity doing the work pride refused to. And then, the quiet again. I waited for my body to unclench. It didn't. Not at first. You can't unlearn vigilance like a song you suddenly stop humming. But the angle of my watchfulness changed. Less outward, more inward. I tried to find the places where anger had built small annexes inside me and evict them carefully, like you would a tenant who'd paid rent on time but ruined the walls. I thought that was the end. It wasn't, because stories like this don't end with an apology. They end when the last ripple finds a shore. Mine arrived in the form of a knock on my door at 7:12 on a Tuesday morning. The hour itself felt like a judgment. I opened it to find Daniel. Camera bag, unbrushed hair, the same sparrow-bright eyes on my doormat. "Can I come in?" he asked too quickly. "Daniel," I said, "you text me at terrible times buying me into your emergencies." "Harper," he said, stepping inside anyway, "you need to see this." He put his camera on the table and slid out the memory card with the reverence of a surgeon. He navigated to a folder marked with yesterday's date and opened a sequence. The balcony again, Halden Street, a different tenant now. A man I didn't recognize, head shaved, reading on a deck chair. The angle changed. Across the street, in the window of the building that had once housed the toothbrush, was a reflection I did recognize. Liam. He was not with Nina. Nina was no longer in the city, if her posted island sunsets were real. He was with a man I didn't know but whose posture was an essay in impatience. Photo after photo. The man gesturing, Liam nodding, papers on a table, money changing hands. "I wasn't looking for him," Daniel said, anticipatory, defensive. "I was shooting fire escapes. They were just there. And there's more." He clicked to another series. Screenshots, not photos, of a small forum I'd never seen. A handful of threads. Usernames like torn posters. One thread titled, "Surviving Narcissist Sabotage, Legal Steps." Another, "Publicly Accused, Privately Innocent, Damage Control." A third, DACA, Countermeasures. In the comments, a familiar tone. Clean sentences that sounded like Liam's when he's asking for permission disguised as advice. "This is probably nothing," Daniel said, softening. "But I thought." "You did the right thing," I said. My voice stayed calm, but my hands had gone cold. The word countermeasures clanged in my head like a dropped pan. I read a comment that said, "Document everything. Offer mediation. If the other party remains aggressive, collect evidence of harassment. Courts love a pattern." Another, "Hire someone to collect digital footprints. The small mistakes hurt them most. Paranoia is a poor diet, but it'll keep you alive when you need it to." I breathed in slow, the way my therapist had taught me with a patience I fought and then reluctantly respected. I could see the outline of a plan that wasn't mine. "What are you going to do?" Daniel asked. "Check if I'm in danger," I said. "Then make sure I'm not." I started with the simple things. I pulled my credit reports. Clean. I checked my email for unknown sign-in attempts. Nothing odd. I rewired a few small routines. Different routes, different coffee shop, different hours for walking home. I told 2 friends who would not dramatize it. I sent a concise formal email to Alana, attaching screenshots from the forum and asking a simple question. Is Liam planning to re-engage this via legal channels? It was both a heads-up and a trap. If she was still neutral, she would tell me to stop imagining ghosts. If she wasn't, she would reveal an agenda. She replied the next morning, "I am not aware of any such plans. If anything arises, I'll inform you." I believed her. Her neutrality was a posture, but it wasn't a lie. I left the photos alone for 3 days, because sometimes the most strategic move is to refuse to play a game you haven't named. On the 4th day, a letter arrived in my mailbox with no return address and the kind of stamp you buy when you don't want a clerk to remember your face. Inside, a single typed line. "Rumor is a blade. Careful not to cut your own wrist." No signature. I sat at the table with the letter in front of me and counted backwards from 100. At 92, I picked up my phone and called Ruth. "Harper?" she said, surprised and then cautious. "I received a letter," I said. "An anonymous warning. It may be nothing, but I'd prefer not to be surprised. Has Liam been—" I searched for a neutral verb. "Discussing me?" She was quiet long enough that I heard the click of her breath. He's been a volatile, she said finally. He's embarrassed. He's angry at himself. He's angrier at you. I've told him that's a misdirection. Is he seeing someone new? I asked, for reasons I couldn't articulate. A consultant, she said dryly, who speaks in terms like narrative reclamation. I don't like him. Has Liam mentioned legal action? I asked. No, she said. But he's talked about collecting proof that you interfered. He believes if he can show that, he can erase what he did. The irony, I said before I could stop myself. Harper, she said, voice softening. I know you're not the villain he needs you to be. I know, I said. But he only needs one person to believe that I am to make the next few months very inconvenient. After I hung up, I considered my options. The obvious one, lawyer up, go offensive, tasted like tin. Another option, do nothing, trust that noise dissipates, felt naive. The third option was the only one I trusted. Build a file as clean as a hospital floor. I bought a notebook with grid paper and labeled it with the date. I printed emails and stapled them neatly. I made a timeline of verifiable facts. The affair, the dates, the mediation, the apology, the client admissions. I included exactly one page titled, Things I Did, with clarity and no self-forgiveness. Who I spoke to when, what was said. No flourishes. No gossip. If a future room demanded receipts, I would not arrive with a story. I would arrive with a ledger. Then I did the hardest thing. I stopped. I did not call friends to analyze his forum posts. I did not ask Daniel to go back to Holden Street. I did not reply to the letter, obviously, because it had nowhere to reply to, but I also did not let it annex my day. I went to work. I went to class. I ate dinner without auditioning my lines for a conversation that might never happen. 2 weeks later it happened. A man approached me outside my apartment just after dusk. Clean coat, cheap shoes, a clipboard, the uniform of messengers who need to pretend they're official. Are you Harper Lane? He asked. I said I was. He handed me an envelope thick with appendices and said the incantation. You've been served. Inside, a request for a temporary restraining order, against me. Harassment, it said. Defamation. The petition included a few screenshots, a client's cancellation, we can't extend again, an email I had sent to Ruth, I thought you should know, and a photo of me outside the Halden Street building, Daniel shot, seemingly, labeled, stalking. The first shock was hot, then cold. The second was strategic. I sat down, put the stack on the table, and read every page slowly, circling nothing. Then I called an attorney whose name a colleague had given me months ago, in case the world gets stupid. Her name was Mara. She had the voice of someone who doesn't raise it because she never needs to. Bring everything, she said. Tonight. Her office smelled faintly of lemon and paper. I handed her my neat folder. The irony did not escape me, and she smiled at it the way sculptors smile at a good block of marble. This is excellent, she said. Juries love structure. Judges love brevity. You have both. She read Liam's petition with that quiet bark of laughter lawyers use when something is both infuriating and useful. He's overreached, she said. He's made claims he can't support. He's also given us the forum posts by inference. We can subpoena the site. So we fight. I asked. We respond, she said. And then we set a hearing. And then we prevail. There's a difference between revenge and defense. Revenge is an action. Defense is a posture you hold long enough for the truth to arrive on its own feet. The next days were an exercise in standing still while other people moved. Mara filed responses, attached my timeline, included Liam's apology and the client admissions, and asked the court to sanction him for abuse of process. I went to work, I slept unevenly, I made tea and forgot to drink it. The hearing was on a Friday. The courtroom was the smallest kind, with seats that punished knees. Liam sat at the respondent's table in a suit that was trying very hard. His consultant was there, jaw set, eyes scanning for weaknesses like a dentist who overestimates his charisma. Mara spoke for me, Liam's lawyer spoke for him, performing righteousness like a closing argument in a television show where the jury is visible and gullible. When it was my turn, Mara asked me only the questions that mattered. Did you physically threaten Mr. Keene? No. Did you publish false statements about his professional conduct? No. Did Mr. Keene admit to his clients that he missed deadlines due to his own choices? Yes, I said, and we produced the emails. The judge read them silently, lips moving the way readers' lips do when the words carry weight. Liam's lawyer tried their angle. Ms. Lane deliberately engaged in a campaign to damage my client's livelihood. I rearranged accurate information, I said simply, when the judge allowed me to answer directly. I told the truth to people with a right to know it. He calls it a campaign because he would prefer my patients looked like Mercy. The judge didn't smile. Judges rarely do. But he nodded, once, a small acknowledgement that the grammar of the situation was clear. He dismissed Liam's petition as unsupported, admonished him not to weaponize the court to manage a breakup, and granted our motion for fees in an amount that made his consultant's face twitch. Outside the courtroom, the consultant tried to talk to me. You didn't have to make it ugly, he said. I didn't, I said. He did. You amplified it. He opened his mouth and then closed it, like a goldfish startled by its bowl. Mara touched my elbow, a quiet steer toward the hallway. Don't give them lines to use, she murmured. I nodded. We left. That night, I slept like a person whose spine had been lowered carefully back into place. In the weeks that followed, the quiet returned again, but this time it had a different texture. Not suspicious, just newly available. The letter writer didn't write again. Daniel sent me photos of rooftops without people in them. Ruth texted me a picture of her garden and then 5 minutes later, followed it with a message that read simply, I'm sorry for my son. I answered, I'm sorry too. It felt less like absolution and more like inventory. I rebuilt, again, this time not in opposition to anything but toward something. I took a course that required me to speak in front of strangers every week until my throat stopped feeling like a fist. I found a part of the city that didn't remind me of yellow dresses or apartment keys. I bought 2 new plates and gave the old ones away. Small acts of architecture. One afternoon in early winter, I walked past the mediation building. Through the glass I could see Alana in session with 2 people whose mouths were tight and determined. I felt a small, surprising gratitude. There is value in rooms where people practice consequences. I had stepped into one and left with terms that held. Liam did not disappear entirely. I saw his name periodically, attached to projects that were smaller but steadier. Maybe humility had crept in through one of the broken windows. Maybe he was learning, finally, that the only way to rebuild a reputation is to stop asking people to carry it. I didn't wish him harm. That would have required an investment I no longer had any interest in making. Once, in a bookstore not unlike the one where we'd started, I reached for a dog-eared copy of Wolf and my hand collided with someone else's. For a fraction of a second, muscle memory lit up, the old story trying to restart. Then I looked up and saw not Liam but a woman with kind, tired eyes and a laugh ready behind them. We both apologized. I let her take the book. I chose a slim volume of essays instead, the kind that make you feel like the world is a solvable puzzle if you turn your head the right way. On the walk home, I thought about victory, the kind that isn't loud. I had wanted him to feel the floor tilt under his feet. He had. I had wanted to stop checking my phone twice. I did. I had wanted to win in a way that left me with a life instead of a wreckage. I had finally done that. Sometimes revenge is a knife you throw. Sometimes it's a room you leave and lock behind you. Mine had been both. But the real ending, the only one that lasted, was that I built a house elsewhere. I learned the sound of my own shower at night and associated it with nothing but clean, ordinary skin. I kept the photo of the toothbrush for a year, then shredded it into confetti and watched the small paper teeth snow into the bin. The last ripple found its shore on a quiet Sunday morning when my doorbell rang at a decent hour and a neighbor stood there holding a misdelivered parcel with my name on it. Looks like this belongs to you, she said. It does, I said and took it and closed the door, and opened it at my table without flinching at the sound of my own house breathing.